Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 344. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, so I want to get right into it after I do just a quick couple plugs. The first is that you can find the show at the Libertarian Institute and on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. You can find the audio version of the show anywhere you can listen to podcasts, along with the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed. And you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping with our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. High quality CBD products at Paloma Verde. You know, I just got a new shipment from Paloma Verde, and I noticed with the new orders I got, all their bottles, or whatever you get from them, have a little QR code on there, and you can scan that and you can get the lab test results for your CBD right there to ensure that every single product you get from Paloma Verde is high quality. That's probably my favorite part about Paloma Verde, is just, with CBD in the past, it was hit or miss. Now I go order at Paloma Verde, I get high quality CBD products at a good price, and they work consistently every time. So check it out, guys. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. Let's get into the show. All right, first I'm talking about this story that Dave DeCamp wrote for antiwar.com on October 30th. U.S. Air Force to deploy 6 nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Australia in a move aimed at China. Dave writes, Australia's ABC News has reported that the U.S. is prepared to deploy 6 nuclear-capable bombers to Australia in a provocative mood aimed at China. Of course, a lot of what the Biden administration has done on the foreign policy scene is to increase U.S. tensions between the U.S. and China. And of course, this is definitely another step in that direction. If we remember the AUKUS pact, the Australia, UK, and U.S. coming together to share nuclear technology, that was seen as highly provocative by Beijing. And so this is sure to add to that. Now, the U.S. isn't done ramping up tensions in the region. So the first thing I'll point to here is that North Korea carried out a two short-range ballistic missile tests over the weekend, and so that was, I believe, the 26th total test and the 40th plus missile launched by North Korea this year. But this particular article then gets into the war games carried out on the U.S. and South Korea side. And I wrote this on Halloween for the Libertarian Institute. U.S. South Korea began massive aerial war games. Washington and Seoul's advanced warplanes kicked off 5 days of round-the-clock military exercises on Sunday. Pyongyang slammed the war games and suggested it would deliver a more powerful response. This year's edition of the annual war games, Vigilant Storm, and they did rename this, in the past it was Vigilant Ace, is the largest ever. A Pentagon press release said Vigilant Ace, or Storm 23, was designed to practice wartime missions, roles, and tasks in an effort to enhance the combat readiness and survivability of U.S. and South Korean forces. The aerial drills will include nearly 100 American warplanes that will join 140 South Korean aircraft and an Australian refueling tanker. I believe it's the first time there's any official participation by Australia in these annual war games. On Monday, North Korea demanded that the U.S. and South Korea scrap the war games. Pyongyang denounced the joint drills as rehearsal for the invasion and proof of hostile policies by Washington and Seoul. The situation on the Korean Peninsula and its vicinity has entered a serious confrontation phase of power for power again due to the ceaseless and reckless military moves of the U.S. and South Korea, North Korea's foreign ministry said. Military activity on the Korean Peninsula has slowly increased since President Donald Trump demanded North Korea abandon its nuclear weapons during the Hanoi summit in 2019. The pace has swiftly accelerated since Joe Biden took the White House and hardened Washington's posture towards Pyongyang. The Vigilant Storm war games started as South Korea included its annual 12-day Hongok field exercises on Friday. In August, Washington and Seoul conducted joint live-fire war games for the first time in several years. In 2022, North Korea conducted a record 26 missile tests. Pyongyang claims its military activity is a response to Washington and Seoul's aggressive stance. The 7th Air Force spokeswoman, Lieutenant Colonel Kelly Jeter, told Stars and Stripes the training was planned months in advance and is part of what a professional military does. Commenting on Vigilant Storm, Pyongyang's foreign ministry said, if the U.S. continuously persists in the gray military provocations, the DPRK will take into account more powerful follow-up measures, adding, North Korea is ready to take all necessary measures for defending its sovereignty, people's security, and territorial integrity from outside military threats. And so, there's a lot going on here, and I've been updating the Korea situation a lot, so I'm not going to, kind of go back through and discuss every round of provocations that have happened so far, but I want to focus in on this particular thread that's been very much underlined, but has been discussed quite frequently, especially in the mainstream media, in all the articles about the military situation on the Korean Peninsula. And that is for 6+ months now, I would say going back to at least March of 2022, the U.S. and Seoul particularly have been issuing several warnings, and Tokyo as well has been, making similar warnings. And they continue to say that, hey, look, there's a risk that North Korea is going to test a nuclear weapon. And so, what we have seen so far in 2022 is North Korea or the U.S., South Korea, Japan carry out some kind of military maneuver, whether it's a North Korean missile test, a North Korean, flying planes close to the South Korean border, North Korea firing artillery shells. It's, a U.S. aircraft carrier in South Korea, Kamala Harris demanding that North Korea denuclearize while extending America's nuclear umbrella to South Korea. It's the live fire war games. It's the joint agreement, trilateral agreement between the U.S., Seoul, and Tokyo, and then carrying out trilateral war games between those three states in the region. All these provocations, continue to escalate the cycle, right? And so if the U.S. is saying that, we're worried North Korea is going to test a nuclear weapon, then carrying out the largest joint aerial war games ever, it is almost a step that's meant to provoke the North Koreans into testing a nuclear weapon, right? If North Korea were to test a nuclear weapon and then the U.S. and South Korea carry out massive war drills, then, North Korea has to figure that their nuclear weapons test is going to provoke that. And so, that's what we see here. It at this point almost seems like the U.S. and South Korea are doing everything they can to provoke North Korea rather than try to de-escalate the situation. So, this is very concerning that we have, gotten back to, if you look at the level of military activity on the Korean Peninsula, this isn't necessarily matched in the rhetoric from the White House, but certainly the rhetoric from everywhere else, particularly Pyongyang and to some extent even South Korea, Japan. It's not to the fire and fury tweets that we were getting from President Donald Trump, but otherwise, the military situation on the Korean Peninsula is certainly higher than it was in 2017. Again, just minus that very important rhetoric from the president. The one thing that Joe Biden hasn't done, he hasn't come out and threatened to nuke North Korea in a personal statement yet. But if we get that, then, essentially we have returned in full scale to, those 2017 tensions. And that's very concerning because you know, again, this isn't necessarily to go out of my way to praise Donald Trump or anything like that. But the one thing that you had with Donald Trump that was somewhat good on the foreign policy side, wasn't always good, but could be, was that he didn't necessarily follow the Washington consensus. And so when a different president were to escalate to the point that Trump did with North Korea, going and talking to Kim Jong-un and sending letters to Kim Jong-un, Trump was viciously mocked for that. People were painting pictures of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un making out, and even, to a pornographic level portraying their friendship and things like that. Trump was raked over the coals for that, but he really didn't care, right? Because he just didn't care about the Washington consensus on the Korea policy. Hard to imagine that that's going to happen with the current White House, that we could just unroll it as fast, get to the point where in 2017 we're tweeting fire and fury, in 2018 we're sitting down in Singapore and having the greatest diplomatic moment between North Korea and America in the two countries' history. So that is really important. Now let's move on and talk Russia, where it's all bad news, guys. Sorry to say. First article from Dave DeCamp, October 31st. Ukraine tells GOP the U.S. needs to get more than just weapons. Amid talks that a Republican-controlled Congress may not be willing to write a blank check for Ukraine, Kiev's message to the GOP is that they need money to provide money. They need money to provide money to fund the Ukrainian government on top of the weapons that they need to fight Russia. And so they're saying, like, hey, GOP, we really do need, in a very literal sense, just a blank check. Not a blank check for weapons, but just a blank check so we could have money to give to other people, is what the Ukrainians are telling the GOP. Ukrainian officials say they're not worried they will lose military aid if the GOP takes over after the midterms, but they fear economic aid may dry up. Kiev is expecting the U.S. to hand over at least $18 billion to cover a budget deficit for 2023. A lobbyist for the Ukrainian government told Politico that Ukraine expects there to be even more robust weapons packages from Republicans, but it is worried about budgetary aid. There is recognition in Kiev that there's going to have to work with Republicans to help them understand that support for Ukraine can't just be about guns. The lobbyist expects Congress to pass budgetary aid needs for 2023 during the lame duck session before the new Congress is sworn in January, but he says that Ukraine will need such support for years to come. So, they're saying Ukraine, Kiev is chastising the GOP and saying, you have to give us hundreds of billions of dollars in direct military assistance for years to come. This is absurd. This should be laughed at by the GOP, but likely they'll cave to it, just like the congressional progressives did. U.S. military conducting on-site weapons inspection inside Ukraine. And so, this is a little bit of a double-edged sword from kind of my perspective here. In one sense, I think it's a good thing that, there's some kind of inspections going on. The bad thing is you have then uniformed military personnel inside of Ukraine, and if they, die in a Russian military strike because they're around these weapons, apparently could get very dangerous. So Dave writes, a Pentagon official told reporters on Monday that the U.S. military personnel have recently begun on-site inspections of U.S.-provided weapons inside Ukraine, confirming a small U.S. military presence on the ground. U.S. personnel have recently resumed on-site inspections to assess weapons stocks in the country and whatever the security conditions allow, the Pentagon official said. Now, this is maybe one of the things that could have been discussed that wasn't made public in the conversation between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the Russian Minister of Defense. I don't think there's a reason that the Russians would have. Of course, any Pentagon personnel on the ground inside Ukraine is problematic, but I'm sure Russia doesn't necessarily want all these weapons getting lost either, although, them ending up on the front lines isn't great for Russia either. I'm just saying, Russia may not have like a particular interest in taking out these forces if they're just doing inspections. It may not be that dangerous. And, if there's open deconfliction lines between the U.S. and Russia, we've seen in Syria that the two sides are able to kind of navigate and make sure they're not blowing up each other's forces. And so maybe it's possible for the, these soldiers to operate somewhat safely inside of Ukraine. But, they could be doing a lot more. They could be, their job could be overseeing the weapon shipments, but that really means just helping those weapons to get to the most efficient place on the battlefield as possible. So, the official said that the return of a defense attaché to the Office of Defense Cooperation Personnel to Ukraine has enabled the inspections. Both the defense attaché and the Department of Defense Cooperation personnel are based at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Defense attachés are military officers stationed at U.S. embassies that represent the Pentagon's interests in the country. The Ukrainian government has previously said that defense attachés, Brigadier General Mark Harmon, arrived in the country back in August. And so, I would imagine that they have to actually be outside of the embassy to in any meaningful way conduct inspections of these weapons. All right, let's move on now. And I want to talk about this other article that Dave DeCamp wrote for antiwar.com. Finnish law enforcement, arms sent to Ukraine ending up in the hands of criminals. Oh, what a surprise for anybody who hasn't listened to this show for the past 8 months or so. Finland's national law enforcement agency, the National Bureau of Investigations, has warned that weapons being shipped to Ukraine are ending up in the hands of criminal gangs. The Finnish broadcaster YLE reported Sunday that a paramilitary preliminary investigation conducted by the NBI found that criminals in Finland may have captured military arms sent to Ukraine. We've seen signs that these weapons are already finding their way into Finland, the NBI's detective superintendent told YLE. And they said that the weapons shipped to Ukraine have also been found in Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. They didn't specify what type of weapons criminals are getting a hold of, and the YLE report only mentioned rifles. However, the routes for trafficking weapons from Ukraine were already in place, and said motorcycle gangs were involved in the activity. 3 of the world's largest motorcycle gangs are a part of the larger international organizations active in Finland. One of these, Bandidos MC, which has a union in every major Ukrainian city, the NBI official said. There had been virtually no oversight of the tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons that the U.S. and other NATO countries have been pouring into Ukraine. Back in April, one source briefed the U.S. intelligence told CNN that sending weapons into Ukraine was like dropping arms into a big black hole. And I covered that at the time for the Libertarian Institute. I just want to mention on this story that, they're talking about American weapons here. And you have to, I guess, imagine from my perspective that a lot of the weapons that I'm guessing are getting into the hands of gangs are the weapons that went directly into the hands of people when Kiev opens its arms depot as Russia was invading the country in February. That there has to be a lot of weapons gained out then. And also, I would guess that there's a pretty big chance that a lot of the weapons that end up on the market are going to be former Soviet weapons that, kind of leak out as the Ukraine gets new American weapons. So in the last show, I talked about the U.S. deploying its new B-61 nuclear bombs to Europe. Dave DeCamp writes, Russia says U.S. lowering nuclear threshold by upgrading nukes in Europe. A Russian official said Saturday that the U.S. is lowering the nuclear threshold by sending an upgraded version of the B-61 nuclear bomb to NATO bases in Europe. The B-61 is the U.S.'s primary thermonuclear gravity bomb, and it is being modernized to a newer weapon known as the B-61-12. Politico reported last week that the U.S. told NATO allies at a recent meeting that it is deploying the B-61-12 to Europe to replace the older bombs by this December, a faster timeline than originally planned for a spring deployment. We cannot ignore the plans to modernize nuclear weapons. Those free-for-all bombs are in Europe, said Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko, according to the Russian RIA news agency. And so, I talked about these bombs quite a bit on the last show, so I don't want to review it all the way. I just want to mention that, Russia's saying that it's lowering the nuclear threshold. What that means is the Kremlin is saying that we now have to be on higher alert of when we will use our nuclear bombs, and we have to, potentially use our nuclear weapons in a scenario we wouldn't have used them before, because these new nuclear weapons are a greater threat to Russia and can be deployed on more type of different weapons platforms. All right, so this is probably the most significant thing going on in Ukraine, at least as far as the implications for the rest of the world. Flurry of drones attacks Russians' Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. A flurry of armed drone aircraft and boats attacked Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, Crimea on Saturday, the Russian Defense Ministry said. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement that Ukraine carried out the attack, which involved 9 aerial drones and 7 unmanned boats. The ministry said both military and civilian vessels were targeted and that one Russian ship was damaged. Moscow accused British specialists of being involved in the attack by training Ukrainian special forces. The preparation for this terrorist act and the training of military personnel of the 73rd Marine Special Operations Center were carried out under the supervision of British specialists, the Russian Defense Ministry said. London has been involved in the incident, although the UK has been training, London denied being involved in the incident, although the UK has been training Ukrainian forces and reportedly special operators' presence on the ground in Ukraine. Russia said on Sunday that it recovered and analyzed the wreckage of drones that were used to attack the Black Sea Fleet. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed that the drones were equipped with navigation equipment that was made in Canada. Like most recent attacks in Crimea, Ukraine has not taken credit for the operation in Sevastopol, but said there is little doubt that Kiev was responsible. The U.S. and its allies have said that they support Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014. Moscow announced it demonstrated its willingness to escalate in response to attacks in Crimea after a truck bombing on the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the most extensive missile strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure that have been seen in the war. So the most important part about this whole thing is that Turkey is in talks with Russia on resuming the deal, but Russia suspended the grain export deal after the attack on the Black Sea Fleet. Russia has pulled out of a Turkey and UN brokered deal that allowed grain exports to leave Ukraine's Black Sea ports in response to a drone attack against the Russian Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. In an attempt to revive the deal, the Turkish defense minister said that the Turkish Defense Department is speaking with the Russian and Ukrainian counterparts. Since the deal was signed in July, grain shipments have been overseen by a coordination center in Istanbul, which is stationed by personnel from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN. The governments have been success and its suspension with over 9 million tons of grains and other foodstuffs shipped out of Ukraine since its signing. So, this deal has been really important and it fell apart. I think Russia said the one ship that received damage was a minesweeper, which is interesting because one of the things that was actually preventing the export of the food and stuff through Ukraine was undersea mines that were planted by the Ukrainian side. Turkey vows to keep Ukraine deal moving after Russia suspends deal. This is from Day to Camp on October 31st. Turkey said on Monday it was committed to ensuring grain will keep shipping out of Ukraine's Black Sea ports despite Moscow's saying it would suspend participation in the export deal. Even if Russia behaves hesitantly because it didn't receive the same benefits, we will continue decisively in our effort to serve humanity, the Turkish president said. And again, I have been very critical of Erdogan in the past on this show. Certainly going back to the foreign policy focus and the war in Syria, I was extremely critical of him and the actions that he took and how it impacted the people of the region. However, if you want to look at what's happened from February on, Erdogan has done a lot of work to try to end this war, one, and number two, to get as much commerce from Ukraine and Russia as possible, and that's been hugely beneficial to the world. The grain deal was initially brokered by the UN and Turkey, and is overseen by a center in Istanbul. So Moscow said over the weekend that the deal was suspended as a result of the strike on its Black Sea fleet, and this is creating a lot of problems. Politico is reporting today that the grain, the price of grain, I think white grain is up 6% and red is up 5 or something like that. And this it seems to be the last response, or not the last maybe, but the most up-to-date response to Russia because of the attack on the Black Sea fleet. And as Russia on Monday launched more missile barrages against Ukrainian energy infrastructure after Ukraine launched a drone attack on the Russian Black Sea fleet in Crimea. And so, this is interesting how this is working out, right? Where Kiev continues to attack Russia in Crimea, even though it's drawing these very serious responses from Moscow, where Ukraine has been able to attack a lot of Russian positions, and even at times, they were able to attack the Russian homeland. And carry out attacks on the Russian homeland that didn't draw quite such a massive response from the Kremlin. And so to continue to push these attacks on the Black Sea fleet is very interesting and kind of baffling why it's going on. But I'll continue to update and break it down as we get more news on this. And, very, very concerning and troubling times we have here. Anyways, everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. More shows later in the week.